waste. Waste. Okay, that's what we're going to be talking about. The not so much the production of it. The production of it has simply exploded over recent years. Beijing, for example, the per capita GDP has probably increased by a factor of not three, but 30 times since Professor Goldstein started this research. And with that affluence has come greater consumption and a whole lot more stuff being thrown away. And so that is very much apparent to anybody who lives in any city, anywhere, how this is dealt with. Professor Goldstein looks at Beijing and over the past century, how it and its people have coped with waste. Night soil, plastic waste, all of these different things are part of the story that he looks at. Now, Professor Goldstein, as I mentioned, teaches in the Department of History at USC. He also teaches courses such as China and the World and a whole host of other things. But this book demonstrates that he continues to be an incredibly creative scholar. How he gets into this subject and what he illuminates by looking at recycling, looking at governance or attempts to govern recycling, looking at how it progresses, the needs it meets, the people who do the work. By doing this, he illuminates so much about the politics, about the economics, about the social construct in Beijing over the course of a long century. Now, this kind of creativity is really standard operating procedure for Professor Goldstein. His earlier book looked at the reemergence, the use of Peking opera, how it was recreated and put to the task as this is Chinese culture. And so he has explored difficult subjects in interesting ways and illuminated life in such a powerful fashion. So we're really fortunate to have him with us today. And so what we'll do is we'll ask a few questions. Professor Goldstein will respond. Then we're going to look at one of the real assets of this book that you can, even before you get the book, take a look at. He has created a multimedia website that features images from Google Earth and other resources, as well as pictures he's taken, pictures that professional photographers have taken, and that is available at this Scalar website that's just been dropped into the chat space. So click on that chat button and you'll have access to that link. We're also going to post up a link to the book so that you'll have access if you'd like to go ahead and get a copy of the book. So please, any questions, do submit those. And so first of all, Josh, it's great to see you. You've worked on this for a very long time. When I first met you in 2006, you were already deep into the subject, a pun very much intended. Your book on Beijing opera hadn't quite come out, but you had already invested a lot of time in excavating this topic.
Well, thanks a bunch, Clay. That was super. I'm going to have a lot of trouble living up to that that intro in this next 45 minutes or hour or whatever. Yeah, I had started pretty much while I was working, even in the 90s a little bit, because I just always have been really interested in scrap. And so it was something that you could see back in the 90s all over the place in Beijing. You know, especially in the 90s, it seemed like Beijing went through about 2 complete excavations and rebuilds. It was constantly being bulldozed and rebuilt. And out of all of that creative destruction, there was a lot of scrap. And just outside the gates of Beida every afternoon, I would see sanloncha, these 3-wheeled carts with bike, riders on them, one after another, just like just going by with scrap on them. And I was just like, where are they going? And it was just incredibly fascinating when I would get to those places and realize that there was basically these extremely just kind of precise, complicated, but unenclosed markets just lining the streets, where somebody would stand there and using a hand scale with weights that you would use in the vegetable markets at that time. But on the big dish for the hand scale, there would be a tower of 6 or 7 feet of styrofoam against a little weight, and they'd pay somebody a little money for that. And then there would be separated, bottles for food oils that were being collected by one person, and for buckets for paint from another person. And I was just really amazed at how everything was sorted and what was going on there.
Well, one of the striking things from my perspective is in the early 1980s, when you went to a market, you went with your little string bag and you bought items like this. And one of the things that's happened in the so-called reform era is it's really been a packaging revolution. There's a whole lot more packaging than ever before. And I know you're going to take us on a tour of an extreme case of that in just a minute. But I wanted to come back to this. You've worked on this for a long time and have opened all kinds of doors and gone to so many different places, interviewed so many different people as part of your research for this project. I have a sense now of what caught your attention and why it held it. How large these markets were, how precise, and how unknown they had been to you, that sort of thing. But what did you want to know? What did you think you were getting into? What did you hope to illuminate by looking at waste management, by looking at recycling? What were your aims?
At first, it was pretty simple. It was a pretty basic story about local, rural, urban development tensions and the kind of sham of green consciousness that exists both in, it exists everywhere, right? These kinds of assumptions that somehow if you're a more educated elite person and then you buy the right things and you manage your waste properly, you're somehow being a better earthly citizen than, other folks on the world, on the earth, especially, poorer and less educated, that don't understand that, that they should throw their plastic in a certain place. And, especially in the early 2000s, there was, in late 1990s as well, the rhetoric in China at the time about rural people in the city when the Hukou regime was so restrictive and was so intensely discriminatory was very, very clearly, disturbing and, resonant with someone from SoCal like me of the ways that what immigrants from outside the U.S. were talked about and undocumented people were talked about, et cetera. And so and then there was also this movement starting in the universities where, students and kind of local Beijing NGOs were starting to put together little collection groups that would go to a community, an apartment community, and basically kick the migrant collectors out and say, no, you must trade your recycling with us because we're teaching you how to be green citizens and we'll trade you a notebook or something for your scrap. And I was like, well, what are you really doing with that scrap? And it would basically just go right into the same recycling system that everything else was going into, that the migrants all ran and managed anyway. But it was just, made some migrant person's life a little bit less profitable for a while they were elbowed out and basically had more rhetoric piled on them of they're the problem, they create the dirt, they're a nuisance in the city. So I was thinking that was going to be just a fairly quick story to tell. And then when I ended up doing some work writing it up, I was back in the States, and I went to a bar and sat down next to some guy, and we started talking, and he was like, he was a waste hauler, and he was like, China's taking it all.
Yeah.
And this was like in 2000. I was like, what are you talking? What? He's like, it's all going to China. And I was like, whoa, okay. And I started to realize that, I'd always known it was a globalization story, but I had not realized how huge of a globalization story it was that I was stumbling into. And then that became just a much bigger picture. So that's kind of where, and now I'm kind of stuck on it, and I'm not gonna, yeah.
Oh, I think you've explained it very well. The notion of green patriots trying to educate others about how to do this, and supplanting the migrant laborers who had lived off of this. So you're taking one privileged group and coming in and moving the most disenfranchised group aside. And doing this sort of thing. Your book illuminates so much about changing economic circumstances in China. I learned from page 1 all the way through all sorts of things that I hadn't thought of, that I should have known. For example, just as a throwaway factoid, again, no pun intended, the notion that China was importing, China, the land that invented, the people who invented paper, were importing newsprint from Japan and the United States in order to produce, modern newspapers in the 1900s. That sort of thing was really stuck with me. But there's a lot here about the economics, about the politics, and also about what you just got at, the question of society, attitudes towards people, attitudes people have towards themselves, this sort of thing. And that comes out. And so looking at waste allows you to really explore this in a lot of different ways, and the processing of it. So that's really one of the real strengths of the book. It occurred to me, though, very early on, he's looking at Beijing. What's special about Beijing? For portions of this long century, Beijing is the capital, right? How does that factor in? Beijing now is this megalopolis of 20, 21 million people. How does that factor in? Would the story have been different if you had been in Shanghai, Guangzhou, somewhere else? What about looking at Beijing was particularly useful?
Well, I think a lot of the really important stuff about Beijing itself, there's maybe two things. One is much more the earlier history stuff, right? And Madeline Dong's work, and she was like my classmate, and I learned a ton from her. And she really actually focused in her book quite a bit also on scrappers, and the reuse of goods and repurposing of scrap goods and all of that. And I thought that was really amazing stuff. And that is very, a whole chapter in my book has basically been inspired by that work. But I think what makes Beijing really interesting in that Republican era period, especially, is watching a center of consumption. China's really, where a huge amount of the best products of all of the empire are flowing into for elite consumption, being very quickly, sidetracked by a 20th century modernization process that puts the focus on coastal cities and moves some of the activity over to Tianjin, and can effectively bypass Beijing, and also by losing its political clout and its money and wealth, it becomes much less of a consuming center, so it can't even draw the goods to it in the same way. And that leads to an incredibly vibrant kind of modus vivendi, or whatever. People have to find a way to survive in this when they've been dislocated from this wealth. And one way people get by is by selling their stuff. There's a lot of used goods to be sold, and a lot of antiques, and a lot of and even archive, things that would now be in the archives of the, like we've got extra paper, we can sell it for paper scrap, and that there are people like Chirushan who, one of the funny little links between my earlier work and this was that Chirushan actually would go to these markets and sometimes be like, oh my God, here's a bunch of old scripts that somebody was throwing out of the, or selling to get more money. So that, the importance of used goods and repurposing of goods and all that, and how central that was to kind of the cultural life of Beijing and the image of Beijing, Tianqiao, and then the books of Lao She, you kind of see these things all over them, is really one thing. And then the other, there's the political stamp of becoming the capital again, and the Communist Party having so much influence and wanting to make Beijing a model in so many ways. And so, you see that in, I think it's not atypical. I think all the other big cities were similar, but just the kind of clarity of like, we will not let, this area of the city smell like poop, and we will not let migrants come here and do things freely, especially at specific times of the year, not just in the Mao era, but also especially in the Reform era. I think, so if I was looking at the everyday administration of migrant informal recycling in Shanghai or another city, the hand of the state would be less heavy. And the amount of kind of, state-sanctioned violence or disruption or eviction and, would be, I think, a good deal lighter in some other cities.
Yeah, so Beijing is the capital. Everything there has tended to be tighter, right? During the Mao era, there was greater regulation of more products, ration coupons for this stuff. And as you've highlighted in the book, there's the Olympics looms very large in this story, right? We're putting this city out for the world to see. And so it's going to be our definition of China. And so that, that plays into this. Now, you've already kind of highlighted the regimes that, you talk about a recycling regime throughout your book, but the political status of Beijing and how that changes, and even within these various periods, right? Including the post-Mao period, you break it up. And I'm curious, you're a historian, so your inclination is to do things from this historical perspective and to spin this out. But what is it? Why is this sweeping look so important? What does it illuminate, either about the resiliency of these people, about the modernizing tendencies and biases of officials? What does using this historical perspective, moving across, from the end of the Qing into this modernizing, even warlords wanted to change things. And one of the striking things is that, they do this survey of the sewer system in 1916 and find out that it's collapsed, that it's not working, right? That sort of thing. And so they are concerned with these things. So what is it about this sweeping look that helps us to really take important points away?
Gosh, I thought I was going to answer that with the book, but I really don't feel like I quite did. Because there's, I think, so many things that could be, and I don't think I pieced them all together at all. But I guess some of the things that I think I'd like to get across, one is the big question of of a systemic metabolism, right? That into trying to understand how materials and goods flow in relation to of the city, in relation to its surrounding and globalization even, and how those flows work. And I guess one of the biggest shifts, right, is that in the Republican era and the Qing before it, you have a real interaction around between rural and urban in terms of, night soil, and some other goods as well. But it's basically, there's a give and take between the countryside and the city that actually, and it's not just for Beijing, but for most big cities in China. There was like a band around the city of rural land that was more fertile than the land that was beyond it, because it got the benefit of all of the night soil, all of the human waste made into fertilizer that could be used to fertilize all the fields around the city. So it created this ring of agricultural prosperity. And if we look at it in the long term, what we see is the transformation of that ring of productivity into a ring of dumps that are, even by the, become more and more toxic as we get into the 1980s and 90s, and full of plastic and other waste. And I think what was interesting to me also was that transition, which happens in the Mao era, essentially, the kind of, despite the interest in using night soil and using all wastes and making sure that and really a valuing in all kinds of ways in the economic theory and political theory of this idea that you would have a cycle that would bring the rural and urban together and feed off each other in a positive loop. They severed that loop and turned the suburbs into wastelands, and basically created the sort of land value relationship that undervalues the land of rural land versus urban. And it's a kind of relationship of land values that we, I think, associate with capitalism and how capitalist urbanization works. And yet it actually gets its foundations in the Mao era. So that to me was one whole set of the kind of urban metabolism question. And I don't feel like quite followed it as far as I would like to, because it's there's so many parts of the urban metabolism. And I feel like I left out huge chunks of it, like automobiles and auto waste and all that stuff. The other big historical question, I guess, that I think is that, waste illuminates tons of stuff, and that people are interested, I would just say, go to the Discard Studies website and just go through it. This project helped me discover Discard Studies, and I think it's just a brilliant, amazing set of scholars doing great stuff. But a lot of waste history and waste discussion comes down to definitions of what you're talking about, right? I mean, what do we mean by waste? And it gets positioned in relation to a bunch of economic categories that we think in, and we come to think in an industrial economics and in all the ways we talk about GDP and stuff, that there's kind of production and consumption and disposal, these three chunks of how things work, and that's how everything gets measured, and that's how everything moves through our system. And looking at recycling and what happens with goods in a in the Republican era, or, this is true in almost every kind of pre-industrial system on some level, is that those chunks don't make any sense. That really what's going on is like things are constantly getting repaired and refurbished and repurposed, and very little of it is ever finally disposed. And what it is, it's often just organic and it decays. And so we don't necessarily think of it as waste. And so it's once we kind of become, it helps denormalize, denaturalize those categories. And I think that especially in our contemporary world, where we are talking so much about the need for more sustainability, circularity, et cetera, it's a really helpful, important lens that we can throw at stuff, right? So, when countries, I think it's, the Netherlands or that do things like say, what we need to do is actually subsidize repair shops, right? Like if we want a more sustainable economy, we need to start taking these categories that we don't usually think about as adding to GDP and realize how crucial they are to creating a different sort of economy. And so that's, I like that aspect of denaturalizing these major categories.
Well, and you make this point at several junctures where, one former recycler is now a washing machine repairman. and he got experience by fixing up the stuff that he picked up and that sort of thing. And you highlight the point that take a refrigerator, take a piece of electronics, that there's no way you can recycle the components of that so as to lessen, to match the value if you can just repair it.
Right.
If you can keep it in service as opposed to, producing it in reverse, taking it apart and doing, that sort of thing.
Right. No, I mean, the question of what defines waste it actually becomes a really hot, if you're into the waste world much, it's a really important international topic in some ways, right? Because there's this whole thing about e-waste, right? People are really concerned about the international trade in e-waste and the fact that, we send our computers to other places and they're dismantled, people burn wires and so much of that is based on a completely faulty definition of waste, right? The whole term e-waste is a totally misused, generally largely misused term, right? That most of what's going abroad and most of what sits in your house that is not being used because it's broken is not it just needs to be repaired, or it needs a market for someone who wants a computer that does what it does, who's probably living in another country or has less means available to buy the newest product. And that's what's been moving most so-called e-waste across the planet. And by defining that stuff as waste, which is what many international conventions have done, and with good, good intentions, I would say, for most people involved in making these definitions, and the UN and Interpol and all those people are involved. But it's had a actually very backfiring effect by defining goods that are being traded for repair and refurbishment and reuse as waste, and making it illegal to move them across borders, which then makes it even harder for people to get a hold of these goods and use them for a longer lifespan, and actually contributes to our destroying them faster and buying more new products and actually creating a lot more waste. So, out of the desire to avoid the pollution from e-waste, we actually have created a set of laws that encourage making more and more of it. And this has to do with this faulty definition of, or how these definitions of waste get thrown at different materials and goods, depending on who's defining them.
Well, we'll definitely come back to where you've just taken us, and we already have at least one or two questions in the Q&A section that actually touch on some of this. The question of who takes care of what we throw away, that sort of thing. But the point you've just made is a really important one that runs through this book. That you aren't, the central concern here for you is not pollution. I mean, it's a concern, but it's not what brought you to this topic. It's, and you highlight the point that most of the pollution, most of the waste isn't post-consumer. It's involved in that production. And so if you value the human labor that can take something and make it work again, you have, eliminated the need for whatever waste would have been responsible for creating the component parts that went into that computer, metallic, plastic, all of those sorts of things. And so, I mean, this book is wonderful in showing us all of these different aspects of this question, at all times being centered on who's doing this. How does this work? What is the strategy? What is the calculation throughout? And one of the resources that it comes with the book that you've created and that I hope you might show us a little bit of right now is this wonderful multimedia website. And we've got a link to it in the chat space. So those of you, who want to, you can go back to it at your own convenience and read and explore on your own. But Josh, why don't you go ahead and share your screen and highlight a couple of the resources that are available at the Scalar website.
Thank you for asking me to do that. Let me get it to the front page first. Um, so so yeah, I mean, part of and this is a work in progress. There's actually a bunch of essays that I haven't posted quite yet because I'm still working on them. But basically, as Clay said, this book took me a long time. It was supposed to be about the Olympics, and I was supposed to get it, out a couple of years after that. But then a lot of things happened in life that made that not happen, and but then a lot of things kept happening in the waste space of China that made me keep having to figure out more stuff. So this website is kind of where I put some other ideas that didn't make it in the book, and especially other pictures, because I think some of the pictures are so compelling, and there's also a lot of danger to pictures of waste and to kind of poverty porn and waste porn. And I haven't quite put those essays up yet. I'm kind of working on how to address those issues as well. But I'm hoping this place will keep growing and have a stuff for that. So anyway, so there's companion images to the book, and you can go through chapters, and there's extra images that didn't ever make it into the book to illustrate or demonstrate some stuff. And then there's also some visual essays that are by kind of topic that I'm still uploading some of. But this one, for example, gets into the Olympics a little bit more. And so one of the things that I've got a few series of that are really cool that I couldn't get in the book are Google Earth pictures of the same spot over time, where you can see how, because these waste markets were often temporary constructions, and so they get kind of pop up in a demolition site or on a rural periphery of a city, and then a few years later they get bulldozed so that somebody can build some high rent stuff. So this is, in this case, you can see that this was a facility that was actually maybe even an informal waste market. And then the city, one of the city's state-owned companies bought it up, and they spruced it all up and roofed it. And you can contrast this is this is a place that I'd visited. So this is a picture of what the facilities actually looked like. And you can contrast that to what they're doing at the very same time to the informal markets, which is closing them off and making them put up these banners that keep you from getting in, including, this place was totally demolished behind the banner for the Beijing Olympics. At this waste site, they took the banner and decided that it was more useful to use it to protect their scrap from the rain than to post it up. And that's kind of a theme in a lot of waste stuff, is the repurposing of things. The state might want you to do one thing with the scrap, but you're going to do something else. This is all these recyclers who'd collected stuff who got stuck because the market they were visiting, they were going to go to sell their stuff just before the Olympics had just been closed down. So you get a sense of what's going on the street when everyone's trying to figure out where to take their stuff now that their market is closed. And this is one of the sites that was it had about 100 plus stalls in it. And they basically detained the owners of the market for 3 days until they were compelled to sign a document that allowed them to demolish it. And the Olympics was a kind of an extreme moment of this, but this is a story for informal recyclers throughout the last 30 years in China. They're constantly being, having the property they're on being removed from it, being evicted, no compensation, of course, for any losses that happen, and forced to go elsewhere to do the recycling. So this essay kind of goes through those. There's another one, and I'll just really quickly show some pictures of this. This is of the creation of an industrial park for scrap that's about 100 kilometers outside of Beijing, and a lot of Beijing scrap would go there. You can see where they did wire burning early on. And again, the Google Earth stuff is great for seeing wire burning. So here's, images, all this black stuff is where they were doing wire burning every night. And then you can see actually how the industrial park did it did have some definite environmental benefits. And one of them is, about 4 or 5 years later, the burning is still there, but they've started to cover areas, et cetera. And eventually, they've pretty much stopped the burning in this area and done a lot of construction. The other part that you can see with more Google Earth photos is that this was a huge land grab buy-up project, right? This area is mostly rural at this point in 2003. By 2009, they've started to build a bunch of complexes, and Ziyaz's industrial park by 2015 has become enormous. They've moved everybody, all the residents, to this compound area so they could take over more of the land and build more of their industrial park. So yeah, that's just, I wanted to be able to show things like this, like the scale of a pile of wire at one of these facilities and just how crazy enormous these things are. And the kind of work that people have to do and we're doing to process things. So yeah, if you would visit the site, that would be awesome. I'd love to, you can also make comments. I'd love to hear what people have or think about all this. And that's my hope, is to put more stuff out there and interact with people who are interested in this issue.
That's terrific. And you've also got a video that we want to take a look at and some photos. But before we do that, a couple quick questions. One is, in your book, when we get to 1949 and the Communist Party comes to power, at the beginning of the Mao era, this is the only time where there's sufficient state control to really change some of what happens. And it's not it's not ideological, it's systematic, it's systemic. It's not, there's controls on life that are the big impediment, not the controls on picking stuff up. And I was wondering if you could say something more about that, because at various times in the latter part of the book, you're talking about a guerrilla army, and that's the reference that others make to, these folks who, for reasons of their own, they're trying to make a living, are out there in the streets picking things up and then taking them somewhere else. And I was wondering if you could explain what happened in the 1950s to change, how this was organized.
Thanks. That's a good question. The irony that really struck me a lot looking at the Mao era and what comes after, right, is that I was really blown away by the documents I found from the 50s of how incredibly, these guys were amazing sociologists. I mean, they're going out there doing incredible field work and casework and figuring stuff out, and they're interviewing everybody and getting a lot of numbers and facts. And so when they're going to talk to people who do recycling or scrap collecting, they're getting all that data. When they're thinking about waste management for the city, there's one document that's like the very first big waste cleanup in 49, when they're like, okay, there's these big mounds of garbage that have been stacked up for decades that they want to clear out of Beijing, and they don't have the equipment, they don't even have a garbage management system, so they're going to use the military, and everybody else is kicking in, and you get this feeling of real excitement from some of these people. They're, in the middle of the meeting going and in the future, we're going to do this. And, and they actually are right. They're actually, we're going to change how coal is packaged, and it's not going to be coal balls. It's going to be beehive coal, and it'll have much less ash, and there'll be less ash in the streets. And that's where we're going with all this people. And what strikes me, what I was kind of amazed by was by the time I'm interviewing people in the recycling bureaucracy of Beijing or China in the 90s and 2000s, is that they don't care, and they don't know, and they have no interest in caring or knowing about the informal sector recyclers at all. That they, as far as they're concerned, they really don't exist. They create documents as if they don't exist when they're managing the system, and when they're managing, it's kind of the police side of the system that talks about them existing and having to get rid of them. But when they actually represent what recycling is in Beijing or whatever, they don't exist. I mean, that's how they kind of convinced the Olympic Committee. There is no, this is a city managed recycling system and we're going to have self-sorting and we're going to have recycling. No, it's not. It's 150, 200,000 migrants who are doing all this work and the system is non-existent. But the Olympic Committee is like, great, recycle for us. And so something happens in the Mao era between the 50s and the 80s, where an incredibly this very interested group of kind of people looking at society saying, how do we solve these problems? What are the people's positions in society that are causing them to do what they do? Turns into stop these people from doing what they're doing, treat them punitively. They're criminals if they don't do what we tell them to do, and we really don't care what's driving them. And that to me was really a strange shift, and obviously has to do with, and especially looking at the people that I'm talking to who are, one of the guys I interviewed was in his 80s, and he had been selling odds and end scrap on the streets in the 40s, and then entered through that, became part of the bureaucracy of the system, and eventually became a manager of a state-run district recycling company. He had been, his life had gotten better and better. The state had, through its processes, and this is not true for everybody, obviously, but he'd come from this really poor, difficult place to a comfortable life as a bureaucrat over an important system with kids that were educated, living in a decent apartment, and yet the attitudes of that very system towards the informal people that started to come out in the 90s was not at all nurturing. and that irony and that really strikes me. And I have difficulty, I don't think I really theorize it or explain it so much as just try to represent it, because I don't feel like there's necessarily one explanation for it, or I don't know what it is, except that, certainly the bureaucracies themselves start to create their own interests and function in their own interests, and eventually see their interests as paramount, and that people who don't manage things in this clear way for them are problematic. And you definitely see that becomes how scrap and waste are dealt with in the Mao era. And I'm sorry, I'm going on too long, but I think one of the things that's kind of interesting about it is that I think it's a characteristic of scrap and waste that even in discard studies doesn't get really addressed as much as I would like, which is, I think we want to really talk about how people are discriminated against if they deal with waste, which they often are. And that's a very deep part of what goes on. But within any managed economic system, waste is really problematic because you can smuggle all kinds of crap through it. You can turn anything, you can basically put a label on anything as this is garbage, this is waste, and then smuggle it through and make lots of money off it if it's not, and that's why it's so highly policed by the socialist system, and also even later they try to, because it's like this, if you let the waste system unravel, people can do anything with it they want. And so it creates this, maybe this over bureaucratic, kind of criminalization of any activity outside of its categories. And so I think there's maybe a bit of that carries into the later period, but.
No, I think you've highlighted several really important points. Is that the Mao era government wanted to understand how this worked, and so actually had to talk to the people who made it work and understood them. And then, because it doesn't want any free agents, it brings everybody into one system or another. State employees, the supply marketing, cooperatives, this sort of thing. You have the socialist reconstruction of industry and commerce applied to recycling and all of those kinds of things. And then fast forward to the reform era, when you start talking about Renko Sujer and the question of human capital and quality labor and quality, this sort of thing, and you start to have much more explicit discrimination, it's the attitudes may have existed, throughout the Mao era, but we see them, getting enforced, getting, state backing. And let me nudge us a little bit based on a couple of the questions that we've received, but also one of the things that you wanted to show us. In your book, you talk about the reform era where China becomes workshop to the world and simultaneously trash can, right? That it starts taking in all of these things that others don't see as much value in, or don't have the low cost labor to exploit, that sort of thing. So you have that. And you have, as you highlighted, this global recycling regime that emerges, right? And now you have also efforts to criminalize some activities associated with it, right? To police it, to ostensibly to clean it up and protect communities and the environment generally. Maybe you could go ahead and show us something about this, about this packaging revolution. And it's not China. China no longer wants your Los Angeles stuff, okay, for the most part. But it's producing plenty of stuff itself.
Yeah.
And so maybe you could say something about that and illustrate it.
So one of the big, I guess, macro narratives about recycling and reuse and stuff in the book is that once you get to an industrial system, we like to think of recycling as somehow it's conserving materials and supposed to make us less of a extractive system. But what actually happens is that recycling absolutely parallels and profits from the extra production of stuff. So, you can. This is something you find everywhere, right? You go check at Stanford University's website about how great their sustainability is, and they'll tell you that they recycled, a huge number of bottles and cans this year, and it keeps going up, and they're doing great recycling with it. It's just like, well, if your numbers keep going up, it just means you've got more and more people drinking soda cans and throwing them away. That's not really helping sustainability. Right. So recycling actually just is very much part of this industrial rising and falling of economic cycles, right? And so with China becoming the workshop of the world, it also has a huge demand for materials, and that's really what drives the recycling industrial system, right? Is the demand for materials in processing. And so there was a huge amount of all kinds of scrap that was going from foreign countries, and especially the US and Europe, EU, into China for that purpose. And then, as you guys all are aware, probably 2017, 2018, China said, we're no longer going to be the world's trash can. And this has been largely presented as an environmentally driven policy. And I guess I think that that's quite a distortion, though I'm not saying that it's entirely dishonest, but I'd say it's largely a distortion that really this is much more driven by a set of economic desires regarding the middle income trap, and also basically trying to crush the informal sector in China and give the formal companies a leg up. So within that context, one of the things that's clearly happening, and this is where I'll share the screen, I guess, is that, as much as China was importing a good deal of waste from abroad, there's a real huge disposability problem in China today, right? And people who are, aware of what's going on with like Kuaidi and Waimai and stuff, right? I mean, all of this delivery to your home of everything and packaging. But this one really struck me. This is individually wrapped stuff being sold in a county seat city. And I was in the supermarket there, and this is a video that's just 1/8 of this portion of the supermarket, which was individually wrapped stuff. So everything you see here, after you see it, multiply it by 8, and that's how much of this kind of material was in this supermarket.
And so this is this single serving revolution here, right?
Mm-hmm. Right. I mean, if you go to smaller village kind of markets, you'll see a lot of this stuff too, but nowhere near this amount of it. But it's a very common way of selling stuff in small quantities for small amounts of money, and in places that where people don't have quite as much income to buy in the big packages. So they're just buying lots of individually wrapped stuff. But I guess the point is that if your goal, if the state's goal is supposedly to, stop plastic waste from being a polluting problem, stopping the shipment of pre-sorted, baled plastic from abroad is probably not going to stop the plastic pollution problem in the Chinese countryside, where there is very little waste management. If this is where people get all their stuff, and so it's kind of, there's, I think, some. You brought this up already, and it's a kind of contradiction in the book, right? The book is very much focused on waste and recycling, and the people that work with that waste and recycling. But in many of the kind of bigger conclusions, the point is post-consumer waste is really not where you're going to solve any of these problems. If you are worried about the pollution that's happening, and it's very worrying, then where we really need to start to shift our focus is things like these right? It's the production side, it's the distribution side. By the time these plastic wrappers are made, it's too late. It really, and then the people who are doing the waste picking and management, they're just helping us out as much as they can to try to manage this stuff. But banning their movement of the stuff to recycle it. Yes, it might make sense to protect some local areas, maybe from local pollution, but in the big picture, it's doing nothing to really solve the pollution problem at all, to stop people from recycling it or trading it. You really need to stop making it.
Yeah, at china.usc.edu, do a search for Josh's name, Josh Goldstein, about plastic. You did a wonderful lecture for us on the problem specifically of plastic. Part of your research on your way to this book. Now, one of the things, again, that you highlight is, there's been a move away from reuse, and one of the things that we really get out of your book is we have the paper reuse industry of Republican era Beijing, where everything gets repurposed, right? It's never thrown away. Or if it's thrown away, it's scavenged and then turned into something else, a container for something, a blotter for some, those sorts of things. And so this has been vital. And looking at these questions is really, really interesting. And so I just want to encourage everybody to get this book because it reveals so much about what we call modernization. It reveals so much about how China has changed. And in many ways, what we see in China may have some particularity to it, but it also illuminates, this overall question of development, what development really means. And so you were talking about, the effort in Beijing to, extinguish this informal sector. And it's not a polite process. It's not just a propaganda effort. And Wang Jing helps to illustrate that with some pictures that you've included, on the Skylar website, and you also have to share. And we've got a couple of questions from viewers. One focuses on the question of education. What's involved here? Is there some way to, integrate the informal sector with formal waste management? Or does it just need to be chaotic?
No,
this sort of thing.
I think there are ways. It's complicated, and I think it's not tried enough, but it is done in places like Brazil. It's been done in places in India. It's been done, we manage it in some weird ways in the US too, with kind of having, places where people who scavenge stuff can sell it versus where, and our single stream system is really not a very good system. So the recycling that we do at home is nowhere near as good as actually the people who are picking stuff and selling it. They're actually doing, believe it or not, a value add-on service. No, I think, one of the very clear things is that, for specifically within the Chinese context of the way that the informal sector was treated, I think, you brought up one of them, I think, Clay, is that in basically for the big picture of what the Chinese government is looking for from the top down, they have looked at this whole process of modernization as a kind of like, it's a transition to something better. And, we're not going to be a government or a state that has people who have to do this for a living, and millions of people, because there really were at some point millions of people involved in scrap picking and management and processing in China. And so there's a kind of desire to just get through this and pass it. And there's also, I think, it's threatening because, if you're going to deal with the informal sector, you're basically recognizing a labor pool collectively that's not under your control. And that's just, as we know, in every part of, like, this is true in every factory and everywhere, like, that's just not that's not possible, right? And so I think that's just the very basic level. And I think everyone who's, in the informal sector in China knows that. And they would always just laugh at me whenever I would start talking about that issue. They would just be like, what do you think? We are not going to organize. We are not going to become a collective bargaining unit. Every once in a while, there'd be a city where there were kind of informal cooperatives acting, but very few. So
yeah, well,
the education, no, I don't think the informal sector needs education in anything. What needs education is the people and this is not just in China, this is all over the frigging planet, where people, because Egypt, India, Brazil, like all of these, Colombia, there's so many countries that try to muscle the informal sector out of the waste management services and try to modernize them and improve them. And the fact is, they should just sit down and listen to these people and start cooperating with them, because they know exactly what's happening. They know exactly what they're doing, but they could use some help of, like, we could use some water treatment plant, and then we could use it as a hub to do what we do around, because we can't afford to build a water treatment plant ourselves, or, so there's all kinds of stuff where if we would just realize that there's this really important value happening here, and not necessarily, and I think there's a real danger in looking at people who handle waste and going, we really need to get past that and have that work go away. And I don't think it's just the Chinese government that wants that. I think every modernizing system somehow thinks that, I got many responses actually to papers I wrote from US scholars as well, being like, but of course this work is bad work and it should never happen. It's like, no, actually waste will always exist and recycling will always exist. And there's really nothing wrong with human beings going through bottles and taking labels off them. just give them decent wages and give them better conditions and deal with the health and pollution issues. And this isn't necessarily like, what's wrong with that? I mean,
well, and let their children go to school in your community. Let healthcare systems, all of those kinds of things, right? And one of the things that I really like about the book is you emphasize the sort. Okay, that the sort, sorting through these things. This is not amateur hour. These people have, hard-won skill, knowledge to pull these things apart. And that if we think of this as, low value added, we're missing a very important point.
Yeah, totally. I mean, and that was also one of those things that struck me was talking to, because a lot of the migrants that I would talk to and would denigrate themselves a lot. Oh, I have no education and I have no, so this is all I can do. And yet some of them were like incredibly savvy businessmen who knew tons about the materials they were working with. And, after a while, it was just like, no, actually, you have tons of skills. You just, but there's such a framing around like you do waste work and you didn't complete junior high school because you didn't have the money to. But yeah, sorting is a huge skill set in a lot of these areas, and especially with electronics. The system that's come out of cities in China was incredibly effective and still to some extent is the one that's still functioning is still really effective at knowing exactly like what parts can be used, what can't, what the markets are like for each thing, how to handle it. But again, they could use some support, like, let's actually help them when they know how to do freon capture, give them a way to do it so they can actually give you the freon and say, good, it's safe, get rid of it, or, put it in the right place. But if you don't actually recognize their work and their, then they're going to have to just set the freon out into the air, and then it's a problem.
Well, as you've already said, waste is a reality. It will not disappear. And so you need to address it. And failing to take advantage of, the resource that these people with their experience, their knowledge, possesses is a mistake. And we only have a few minutes left. I was wondering, Josh, if you could share some of those pictures and tell us what we're seeing from Wang Jing.
Okay, sure. Let me see. Should I do it from the scalar site? Or
either way, however you prefer.
Let me do it through the scalar site, I guess. So yeah, in the last few years, I ran into some pictures by Wang Jing, and then I got to know him a little bit. He's let's just get the screen share.
We don't quite have your screen yet. Yes.
He's a photographer, photojournalist, but he actually is a friend of Wang Zholiang's. I think they're from the same part of Shandong. Wang Zholiang is probably the person who's done more to kind of raise awareness throughout all of China and the world about what's been going on with waste in China, and his movies and photography are wonderful and important. But Wang Jing is not very well known, but he went around Beijing in about 2012, taking pictures in Beijing's waste markets, and really getting to know the people who he was photographing and showing the kind of life that existed in these markets. And let me see if I could show. So here's another picture from 2012 of a woman working in a plastic stall. And here's another picture of a plastic stall. And this one, gives you a sense of what it's like to live in a waste market, right? I mean, you kind of live in a very confined space. You kind of make it into home, and then right out your doors where you're doing all your sorting every day. And and some people had to bring their kids, et cetera, especially during the summer. So he went to these places and he photographed them and took some really wonderful and dramatic kinds of pictures, and then went back to the same spots 5 years later. And sometimes with the people who were in the photographs, and documented them again. So this is this place when it was up and running, and this is the same space with somebody who used to work there holding the photograph. And so basically went to all of these demolished markets and shows what they've become. And I don't have all the pictures up here at all. There's a great series, and I've got a link to the series because I think it's just really beautiful and worth seeing. But in so many ways, these pictures for me capture what I'm trying to get across, certainly in the last part of the book, better than I could ever get it across, which is just the erasure of these people and their lives and their work and their liveliness and just the not just the erasure of the erasure from the space and from the memory of Beijing, right? That these are people whose labor kept Beijing clean and livable for decades. And then they are just uprooted and forgotten, and the areas are grown over or reconstructed into apartment complexes or whatever. And there's just no sign that they were ever there. And there's no narrative ever given of their position in society, really. And that's why, there's also a part in the book where an activist friend of mine who I've learned a huge amount about all kinds of environmental issues in China from, Chun-Li Wen. We went on a kind of some field visits, and she had written some blogs about what we were doing, and her blogs would usually get a few hits, and then we did one visit back to Gusher, where a lot of waste Beijing's pickers are from and recyclers are from. So
this is in Henan province, so some distance.
Yeah, it's about 1,000 kilometers from Beijing. She wrote about what people's lives were like now that they were back in Gusher, because they had been, the markets were being destroyed in Beijing, and for this kind of new regime of recycling, and people were so moved by what she wrote, just because she recognized that they'd been in Beijing and worked there, and that she wasn't she's not a recycler, she's a Beijing resident, and she's actually appreciating that they exist. And the responses people had just to being recognized and having their story told was incredibly moving. Like people were like reading her blog and in tears and saying, "Thank you for writing about my life and not, basically recognizing me and not treating me like a criminal, and and seeing that I actually mattered to making Beijing what it is." And yeah, that to me was just, Wang Jing's photos also just, I think, really bring that aspect of the story really clearly, better than I ever could.
Well, and this is a great addition, to the book, and something that people can access and should definitely take advantage of, being able to access it, to being able to read the supplementary essays, but get the book. The book has this story. And one of the things, Josh, that's been so striking for me in reading your book is at various times, migrant workers are celebrated, in China. At Spring Festival, television gala, you'll have songs celebrating migrant workers. And invariably, these are the migrant workers are the construction workers. Maybe the occasional domestic worker gets into the mix. Maybe even some of the folks working in retail, commercial services, things like that. I don't think I've ever seen somebody who's picking up plastic waste, who's moving cardboard and other paper products and doing that sort of thing. And ultimately, why do you think this is? Why as you say, these people have helped to make the city prosperous and livable. And yet you have this erasure or this effort to erase their contribution.
Wow. Again, I think that's like, there's probably so much going on there. And I don't know if I have an answer to that one that's really going to be more right than what I think a lot of other people might have to say. I mean, I think there's, a desire not to really pay attention to this is one of the basic things. I mean, I've had some, I think one of the people might actually be at this webinar, but I had an advisor. And when I started doing this research, my advisor was like, I never noticed these people. And now that you started working on this, I see that they're everywhere. And I feel like that is really part of this, right? They don't want to really necessarily be seen because being seen doesn't win them any help really, especially in the 90s and early 2000s, right? So better not to be seen anyway. So everybody kind of agrees that it's easier to ignore them in this milieu. And so, certainly there's also the idea that they've, yes, it's always been an informal sector. It's never been in the state's control. It's generally looked poorly upon. And it's also a representation of not of something China wants to be, right? And so all of that, I think, feeds into this maybe desire to just not look and not think about it too much and certainly not celebrate it.
No, I think you've actually, you were afraid that maybe your summary wouldn't do it, but I think you have. That all of us produce waste and none of us want to be responsible for it. We want it to leave, to move away and not to be concerned about that. But the reality is, of course, that somebody has to take care of it. You have to construct the systems. You have to have people who are skilled and able to do this important work. And you mentioned, during the Mao period, there was state recognition and status, not high status, but status, and, incorporation in. And I can certainly understand how somebody who worries about the dismantling of these markets would think that the attention may not be a good thing, that, being under the radar might serve their purposes.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Thank you, Josh, for producing this wonderful book. And I can't encourage viewers anymore. Get this book, read it, visit the website, take advantage of it. It will cause you to, you'll learn a lot, certainly about Beijing over the sweep of this time, but you'll also learn a lot about wherever you are, whatever city you are in. What is your place in this? And Josh does a wonderful job of, putting you on the spot with your yogurt cup or your pizza box, the calculations involved in this global recycling regime, China's place in it, the place of these individuals is really a remarkable story. And it's brought, in the most vivid way to life by Professor Josh Goldstein in, Remains of the Everyday. I can't recommend this book anymore. It's just a terrific read. Thank you so much for producing it and for giving your time to us today.
Well, you've been you say very nice things, and thanks for having me. And if people want to send me emails with questions, if I can try to direct folks to other good sources, because there's a lot of really good stuff out there about discards. And again, if you're really interested in this stuff, check out the Discard Studies website. It's awesome, and there's some really smart people working on really interesting stuff there.
Well, in fact, I'd like to do a poll. We're not going to do a poll, but I'd love to do a poll. What portion of the viewing audience had heard of the field of discard studies and now wants to explore it for what it reveals? We are, archaeologists have been mining garbage dumps for a long time to figure out who we were, how we lived, all of those sorts of things. This is a wonderful study. Take advantage of it. Use the links to visit, the book website, but also the Scalar website. Take a look at the china.usc.edu website, where you can see Josh's earlier presentations. He also, as part of one of his early research trips in Beijing, looking at the recycling of wire, of plastic-coated wire. He wrote a short research report on that early in this process. All of that at the china.usc.edu website. We want you to be on our mailing list. We want you to get friends and colleagues on that list as well. And we hope that everybody comes back in a week's time to hear from Jennifer Pan talking about her book, Welfare for Autocrats. We're grateful, certainly to Professor Goldstein, but we're grateful to you. You joined us today, and we really appreciate it. Thank you. Take care, everyone.
Thanks.